2 weeks before the wedding, I found out her double life. You won't believe what happened next. Hello, read it. 2 weeks, 14 days, 336 hours. That's how long I have until I'm supposed to stand in front of all my family and friends, say I do, and commit myself to a future I've dreamed about for years. Yet, as I sit here in my dimly lit apartment with a cold cup of coffee and my laptop glaring back at me, I feel like my entire life is on the verge of collapse. I'm Nate, 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the guy who keeps it together. Always. People count on me because I've built my identity on being dependable. My friends joke that I'm like a human Swiss Army knife. I always have a plan, a backup plan, and a contingency for when the backup falls through. I've never been one to let things spiral out of control. At least I wasn't, until now. You'd think someone like me would have this whole wedding thing locked down. After all, I'm a project manager by trade. I spend my days organizing massive timelines, coordinating dozens of moving parts, and delivering results under pressure. I thought planning my wedding would be a cakewalk. For the past year, I've had spreadsheets, color-coded calendars, and even weekly check-ins with Emily, my fiancée. I wanted everything to be perfect for her, for us. But as I sit here, staring at a half-filled RSVP list and a stack of disorganized vendor contracts, it's clear that perfection has slipped through my fingers. I've never felt this powerless, this overwhelmed, this lost. Maybe I should have seen it coming. My childhood taught me that life can fall apart in an instant. I grew up in a house where chaos was the default setting. My parents, though well-meaning, had a volatile marriage. They'd go from laughing over dinner to shouting matches that shook the walls in the blink of an eye. As the eldest, I became the fixer, while my little brother, Matthew, hid in his room. I played referee. I learned to tiptoe around their moods, to anticipate problems before they exploded. That instinct to control everything followed me into adulthood, and for the most part, it served me well. When I met Emily 6 years ago, she was like a burst of sunlight piercing through the fog. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever known, spontaneous, unpredictable, and endlessly optimistic. I'm a planner. She thrives in the moment. I used to joke that she could walk into a burning building and come out unscathed, completely unaware it was on fire. But that's what I loved about her. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't before. For 6 years, she's been my anchor, even when life tried to pull me under. She was there when my dad was diagnosed with cancer, sitting with me in the hospital waiting room for hours, never once complaining. She was the one who convinced me to adopt our dog, Charlie, even though I insisted I wasn't a dog person. And last year, when I got down on one knee in the middle of a rainstorm to propose, she laughed through the raindrops and said, "This is so you, Nate. Trying to make it perfect, and the universe does its own thing." That moment feels like a lifetime ago. The first sign of trouble came about a month ago. My best man, Ryan, called me out of the blue, his voice shaky. He said he'd been assigned to a huge work project overseas and wouldn't make it back in time for the wedding. I tried to act calm, told him it was fine, but deep down, I felt the first crack form in my carefully laid plans. Then the hits kept coming. Our caterer called 2 weeks ago to say they'd accidentally double-booked our date and would have to cancel. They offered a half-hearted apology and a partial refund, but it wasn't the money that stung. It was the thought of starting over. Emily's maid of honor, Sarah, dropped out too. She'd eloped with her boyfriend on a whim and decided a destination wedding was more important than attending ours. Emily was devastated, but she tried to laugh it off, saying, "Guess we'll just wing it." I told myself these were just minor setbacks, normal bumps in the road. After all, no wedding is perfect, right? But then, 3 weeks ago, disaster struck in a way I couldn't have predicted. My parents' house, the one I grew up in, burned down. I'll never forget the phone call. It was 3 a.m., and my mom's voice was trembling. "It's gone, Nate," she said. "Everything's gone." I drove to their neighborhood immediately, only to find a smoldering shell of what used to be home. They'd managed to escape unharmed, but the loss was staggering. Decades of memories, family photos, my dad's old record collection, even my childhood trophies, all reduced to ash. Since then, my parents have been unraveling in their own ways. My mom's been glued to me, calling almost daily with complaints about their temporary apartment. My dad, always the stoic one, has retreated into silence. And now, on top of planning a wedding, I feel like I'm trying to hold them together too. But none of that compares to what happened last night. I was going through some wedding documents Emily had left behind, vendor contracts, seating charts, that sort of thing, when I stumbled across a folder I didn't recognize. Inside was a receipt for a venue deposit. At first, I thought it was just a clerical mix-up. But then I saw the name on the receipt, a name I didn't recognize. A venue I didn't recognize. The more I looked, the more I found. There were other receipts, letters, even a guest list, all tied to this other name. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old wedding she helped plan for a friend? But the dates didn't add up. The details didn't add up. What scared me most wasn't the receipts themselves. It was the realization that Emily had never mentioned this part of her life to me. We've spent 6 years together, building a future, and yet here I am, sitting in my living room, staring at evidence of a life I didn't know existed. Now, I'm 2 weeks away from walking down the aisle, and I don't even know if I can trust the person waiting for me at the altar. For most of the night, I just sat there. The folder was open in front of me, its contents strewn across the table like the aftermath of an explosion. My mind churned, trying to stitch together a narrative that made sense. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt like I was grasping at smoke. It was the name that haunted me. Samantha Reed. It appeared again and again on the receipts, contracts, and even a guest list for a wedding planned almost 3 years ago. It wasn't Emily's name, obviously. But why was it tied to her? And why had she never mentioned it? I thought about waking Emily, who was sleeping in the next room, but the weight of what I'd found kept me glued to my chair. What would I even say? Hey, I was digging through the wedding folder and stumbled across evidence of a wedding you never told me about. Care to explain? No, that wasn't a conversation you had at 2 a.m. Instead, I did something I'm not proud of. I started digging. I opened my laptop, typed Samantha Reed into the search bar, and hit enter. 100 results came up, some irrelevant, some eerily plausible. After a few minutes, I narrowed my search to the venue named in the receipts. It was a small, picturesque estate about an hour from here, the kind of place Emily would love. Sure enough, there it was. Samantha Reed's wedding, captured in a series of glowing reviews from vendors and attendees. I stared at the photos. There was the ballroom, decorated with delicate string lights. The garden where the couple had exchanged vows, surrounded by towering oaks. And then I saw it, Emily. She was in the background of one of the photos, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. She was smiling, her arm looped casually through his. They looked happy, comfortable. My chest tightened as I stared at the image, my mind racing. Who was this guy? And why had Emily never mentioned him? By the time I finally closed my laptop, the sun was creeping over the horizon. I hadn't slept, but I felt wired. My thoughts a tangled mess of suspicion and confusion. I tried to focus on the tasks ahead, the final guest list, the calls I needed to make to replace the caterer, but my mind kept drifting back to that photo, that name. Samantha Reed. I told myself I was overreacting, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a friend she'd helped plan a wedding for. Maybe the man in the photo was just an old colleague. But deep down, I knew I wasn't being honest with myself. Emily wasn't just in the background of that wedding. She was a part of it. And if she hadn't told me about it, there had to be a reason. That day, I couldn't bring myself to talk to her about it. Every time I opened my mouth, the words felt too heavy, too final. Instead, I threw myself into the wedding preparations, trying to ignore the gnawing doubt that had taken root in my mind. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. 2 days later, while I was at work, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. She and my dad were supposed to be meeting with an insurance adjuster to discuss the house, but the message made it clear that things hadn't gone as planned. They're saying the fire was our fault, she wrote. Something about faulty wiring. Your dad's upset. Can you come over? I left work early and drove to their temporary apartment, a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a complex that smelled faintly of mildew. My mom greeted me at the door, her eyes red-rimmed. My dad was sitting on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen like it might offer some kind of answer. They're saying we won't get a full payout, my mom explained, her voice tight. They're claiming the wiring was old and not up to code, that it was negligence. I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest. I'd spent years watching my parents struggle, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. They'd finally paid off the mortgage on the house a few years ago, and now this? It wasn't fair. I'll look into it, I told them, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My mom nodded, but my dad didn't even look at me. He just sat there, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As I left their apartment, I felt the weight of their problems pressing down on me, adding to the storm already brewing in my own life. I'd spent years building a life of stability, a fortress against the chaos I'd grown up with. But now, everything was crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. That night, I finally decided to confront Emily. I waited until after dinner, when we were sitting on the couch, watching a rerun of some show we'd both seen a dozen times. I turned to her and said, as casually as I could manage, "Hey, I was going through the wedding folder the other night and found something interesting." Her expression didn't change. "Oh, yeah," I said. "There were some receipts in there for a wedding 3 years ago." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she laughed, a soft, nervous sound. "Oh, that? Yeah, I should have told you. I helped plan a friend's wedding a few years back. It was a big deal, kind of overwhelming, actually." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. "That's nice of you," I said. "Who was the friend?" She hesitated. It was only for a second, but I noticed it. "Samantha," she said. "An old college friend." Her voice was calm, steady. But something about the way she avoided my gaze made my stomach churn. I wanted to push, to ask her why she'd never mentioned this friend before, why there were so many receipts in her name. But instead, I nodded and let it go. That night, I couldn't sleep. Emily's answer should have reassured me, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like she was trying to placate me, like she was hiding something just beneath the surface. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much bigger than I realized. There's a point where suspicion hardens into certainty, and for me, it happened the moment I heard the voicemail. The woman from Greenfield Estate had addressed Samantha Reed directly, confirming details for an event scheduled for next Saturday, my wedding day. It was like a trapdoor had opened beneath me, plunging me into free fall. Samantha wasn't just some irrelevant name from Emily's past. She was tied to our present, our future, in ways Emily had deliberately hidden. For days, I couldn't shake the voicemail or what it implied. The receipts, the venue, the absence of any real explanation. Each detail snapped into place like puzzle pieces, forming an image I didn't want to see. Samantha Reed wasn't a friend Emily had helped. She was Emily, or at least someone she had been before I ever came into her life. The realization left me gutted, but it also lit a fire in me. I needed answers. I spent the next evening buried in research, combing through public records and online databases for any mention of Samantha Reed. Finally, after hours of searching, I found something. A marriage license filed 3 years ago at the same venue listed in the receipts. The names on the license confirmed it. Samantha Reed and a man named David Calloway. I stared at the screen. Emily, or Samantha, or whoever she was, had been married. Not engaged, not planning a wedding, but married. And she'd never told me. My mind raced with questions. What had happened to David? Why had their marriage ended? Had it even ended at all? As if on autopilot, I printed out the records, adding them to the growing stack of evidence on my desk. I thought about confronting Emily, but the weight of what I'd discovered held me back. This wasn't just a lie. It was an entire life she'd kept hidden from me. And if she'd hidden this, what else hadn't she told me? The next morning, I decided to test her. I casually mentioned Greenfield Estate over breakfast, pretending I'd seen an ad for it online. Emily didn't flinch. She smiled and said it sounded lovely, but her tone was so rehearsed, so perfectly neutral, that it set my nerves on edge. She wasn't surprised I'd brought it up. She was deflecting. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, torn between anger and disbelief. Emily's ability to lie so effortlessly, to keep up the illusion of normalcy while hiding something so monumental, was terrifying. That night, I dug deeper into David Calloway. His social media was sparse, but I found an old LinkedIn profile listing him as a software developer in the same city where Greenfield Estate was located. There were no signs of recent activity, no posts or updates in the past 2 years. It was like he'd disappeared. I couldn't stop imagining the worst. Had Emily, Samantha, left him? Had something happened to him? Was she running from a life she wanted to forget? Or was it something darker? My mind kept circling back to the same question. Who was I really marrying? As the week went on, the pressure mounted. My parents' situation added to the chaos. The insurance company was still refusing to pay out for the fire, and my dad had started blaming himself, retreating further into silence. I tried to help where I could, but the strain was overwhelming. And through it all, Emily acted like nothing was wrong. She finalized flower arrangements, confirmed the band, and even joked about how everything was finally falling into place. Her optimism felt cruel, a knife twisted into the growing wound of her betrayal. By Friday, I couldn't take it anymore. I left work early and drove to Greenfield Estate. I needed to see it for myself, to stand where she had stood and try to understand what she was hiding. The estate was stunning, a sprawling property with manicured gardens, ivy-covered archways, and a grand ballroom visible through the windows. It was exactly the kind of place Emily would choose. As I stood there, staring at the venue, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as Kara, the coordinator I'd spoken to on the phone. I didn't correct her when she called me Samantha's representative. Instead, I asked if she could show me around, claiming I needed to verify details for next week's event. She led me through the estate, pointing out the ceremony area, the reception hall, and the bridal suite. Every detail felt hauntingly familiar, like stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. But the real blow came when she handed me a folder of documents to review. Inside were contracts, invoices, and a finalized guest list for the wedding that had taken place 3 years ago. Emily's name wasn't on it, but David Calloway's was. And next to his name, under bride, was Samantha Reed. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The guest list included people I didn't recognize, but some names stood out, friends and family Emily had introduced me to over the years, people I thought were meeting me for the first time. They'd all been there. They'd all known. I left the estate in a daze, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. Emily hadn't just hidden her past. She'd woven it into our present, bringing pieces of it into our life together, as if daring me to uncover them. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, replaying every moment of our relationship in my mind. Every lie, every omission, every calculated move she'd made to keep her secret buried. By the time I finally pulled into our driveway, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house and wondering how I was supposed to go inside, act normal, and pretend I didn't know the truth. But I couldn't pretend anymore. The wedding was in a week, and the life I thought I was building with Emily was unraveling faster than I could piece it back together. The house was quiet when I came home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt like a stranger in my own life, like everything familiar had been twisted into something I couldn't recognize. Emily was already in bed, the soft hum of her breathing drifting down the hallway. In another life, that sound might have comforted me. Now, it felt like a reminder of the widening chasm between us. I closed the door behind me and set the folder from Greenfield Estate on the kitchen counter. Its contents were burned into my mind. The marriage license with her name, the invoices, the guest list. I didn't need to look at them again to know what they meant. Samantha Reed wasn't just a name on paper. She was Emily's past. A past she'd hidden from me, meticulously erasing every trace of it until only the cracks were left for me to stumble upon. I spent the next few days avoiding her as much as I could. I left for work early, came home late, and buried myself in tasks to keep my mind from spiraling. The wedding was now just days away, but I couldn't bring myself to care about table arrangements or playlists. Every time Emily asked me a question, I mumbled something vague, brushing her off before she could pry too deeply into what was wrong. But I could tell she was starting to notice. She wasn't as bubbly as usual, her energy subdued. She started texting me less during the day, and when I came home, she would sit quietly on the couch, scrolling through her phone without making eye contact. I wondered if she felt guilty, if she was grappling with the weight of her secrets just as much as I was grappling with the truth. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. The thought of it felt like stepping off a cliff, with no idea how far the fall would be or if I'd survive the landing. What if there was a reasonable explanation for all of this? What if I was wrong, and I destroyed everything we'd built together over a misunderstanding? But worse, what if I wasn't wrong? What if this was only the tip of the iceberg? The breaking point came 5 days before the wedding. I was sitting in my office, staring blankly at my computer screen, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Greenfield Estate, the venue where Emily or Samantha had been married. My chest tightened as I opened it. The subject line read, "Final invoice for Samantha Reed." It felt like a punch to the gut. I opened the email, and there was a detailed breakdown of the cost for the event. I scanned through the list, recognizing details that felt like ghosts of our own wedding. The florist, the band, even the caterer Emily had fought to book before they canceled. She hadn't just hidden her past. She'd recreated it. The realization sent a fresh wave of anger and disbelief coursing through me. I couldn't sit still anymore. I left work without telling anyone and drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process what I'd uncovered. My thoughts spiraled in every direction, from suspicion to anger to a desperate hope that I was somehow wrong. I ended up in my parents' temporary apartment. It was the only place that felt remotely safe anymore. My mom greeted me at the door, her face lined with worry, but she didn't ask too many questions. She could tell I wasn't ready to talk. Instead, she poured me a cup of coffee and left me alone in the kitchen, giving me space to think. That night, I stayed in my old room, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together the puzzle of Emily's or Samantha's life. The marriage license, the photos, the guest list, they all pointed to a woman I didn't know. A woman who had built her life with someone else before erasing it all and starting over with me. But why? The question gnawed at me, refusing to let go. Had her marriage ended in disaster? Had she run from something or someone? And if she had, why hadn't she told me? The next morning, I decided I couldn't live in the dark any longer. I drove back to Greenfield Estate, determined to get answers. When I arrived, I went straight to the front desk and asked for Kara, the coordinator I'd spoken to before. I didn't bother with pretense this time. I handed her the folder I'd taken and told her I needed to know everything. Kara hesitated, clearly unsure whether she should share anything. But when I explained that I was engaged to Samantha Reed, or at least someone who used to be Samantha Reed, her expression softened. She led me to a small office and pulled up their records. Over the next hour, she filled in the gaps. Samantha Reed and David Calloway had booked the estate for their wedding nearly 4 years ago. The ceremony had gone off without a hitch, and by all accounts, it had been a beautiful event. But just a few months later, Samantha had called to cancel an anniversary party they'd booked as part of their package. Kara said she'd found it strange at the time. Most couples were still in the honeymoon phase after a year. But Samantha had been curt and distant, saying only that the event was no longer necessary. I asked if there had been any follow-up communication, but Kara shook her head. After the cancellation, Samantha disappeared from their records entirely. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying Kara's words in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Emily, or Samantha, hadn't just left her past behind. She'd erased it. By the time I got home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. Emily was waiting for me on the couch, her eyes red and swollen like she'd been crying. She asked where I'd been, her voice thick with worry, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I walked past her without a word and locked myself in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't keep living like this, drowning in doubt and suspicion. But I also couldn't ignore the truth staring me in the face. That night, I stayed up late, spreading everything I'd uncovered across the dining room table. The marriage license, the invoices, the guest list, it all painted a picture of a woman I didn't recognize. The wedding was only days away, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't marry Emily until I knew the full truth. And deep down, I was terrified of what that truth might be. The wedding was 4 days away. The world moved forward as if everything were normal. Vendors sent their last-minute confirmations. Emily finalized seating arrangements, and friends texted me excitedly, asking about tuxedos and speeches. On the surface, it looked like my life was reaching the culmination of years of careful planning. But beneath the surface, everything had unraveled. The dining room table was a graveyard of truths I'd unearthed. The marriage license, the invoices, the guest list from Greenfield Estate. Each piece of evidence stared back at me like a taunt, daring me to confront what I already knew but couldn't fully accept. Emily's life before me wasn't just a distant memory she'd chosen not to share. It was a carefully buried secret, and now that I dug it up, I couldn't unsee it. The woman I loved wasn't who I thought she was. I stayed up late every night trying to make sense of it all. My mind raced with questions that spiraled into darker possibilities. Why had she hidden this from me? What had happened to David Calloway? Was she running from something or someone? The weight of it became too much to bear. 2 days before the wedding, I made the decision to confront her. I'd spent nearly a week sitting on the truth, hoping for a moment of clarity that never came. If I didn't act now, I'd be walking down the aisle with a woman I no longer trusted, and the thought of that was unbearable. Emily was in the living room when I came home, sorting through a box of decorations for the reception. Her expression brightened when she saw me, but the shadow of worry lingered in her eyes. She must have sensed the shift in me, the distance I'd put between us over the past week. I didn't give her time to ask questions. I took the folder from the table, set it down in front of her, and told her I needed the truth. She froze, her hands hovering over the box of decorations. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Her face went pale as she opened the folder and saw what was inside. The silence between us stretched endlessly. Finally, she started to speak. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but every word felt like a hammer striking the fragile shell of our relationship. She admitted everything. Samantha Reed was her real name. 3 years ago, she had married David Calloway, a man she'd met in college. On the surface, their life had seemed perfect. A beautiful wedding, a promising future, but behind closed doors, things had quickly fallen apart. David had been controlling, possessive, and emotionally abusive. The life she'd thought she was building with him turned into a prison, and after months of trying to make it work, she realized she had to leave. She left everything behind. Her name, her job, her friends, even her family. It was the only way she could truly escape. She legally changed her name to Emily, moved to a new city, and started over. Then she met me. She said I was the first person who made her feel safe again. The first person who made her believe she could have a future that wasn't defined by fear. She hadn't told me about her past because she didn't want it to define her, or us. She wanted to leave Samantha Reed behind and become someone new, someone stronger. But as she spoke, I realized it wasn't just her past she had left behind. It was the truth. She had built our relationship on a foundation of omission, crafting a version of herself that she thought I wanted instead of trusting me with the whole picture. When she finished, she looked at me with tears streaming down her face, asking me if I could forgive her. I didn't answer right away. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss of uncertainty. Her story was heartbreaking, but it didn't erase the betrayal I felt. She had lied to me for years, letting me believe I knew her, when in reality, I only knew the parts she'd chosen to show me. That night, I left. I drove aimlessly through the city, my thoughts a storm of anger, sadness, and confusion. I thought about the woman I had fallen in love with, and the stranger I'd discovered beneath the surface. I thought about the vows I had written, the promises I was supposed to make, and whether they meant anything now. By the time the sun rose, I still didn't have answers. But I knew I couldn't marry her. Not yet. The morning of the wedding, I called everyone on the guest list and told them it was postponed. I didn't give an explanation, just said that Emily and I needed more time. Some people were understanding, others were upset, but I didn't care. This wasn't about them. When I went home, Emily was waiting for me. She looked fragile, like she hadn't slept in days. I told her everything. How much I loved her, how much her betrayal had hurt me, and how much I wanted to make this work, but only if we could rebuild it on a foundation of honesty. She cried, and for the first time in weeks, so did I. We didn't get married that day. Instead, we sat on the floor of our living room and talked, really talked, for hours. She told me everything about her life as Samantha Reed, every painful detail she had kept hidden. And I told her about the doubts and fears I'd carried since discovering the truth. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything. But it was a start. In the weeks that followed, we began to rebuild. We went to therapy together, untangling the knots of mistrust and insecurity that had formed between us. Emily, no, Samantha, began reaching out to the friends and family she had left behind, trying to mend the parts of her life she had abandoned. It's been months now, and we're still a work in progress. Some days are harder than others, and there are moments when I still question if I made the right choice. But one thing is clear. The woman I'm building a life with now is someone I know, truly know. The wedding is back on, though we've decided to keep it small this time. No grand venues, no elaborate decorations. Just the two of us, surrounded by the people we love, promising to build something real. Because after everything we've been through, real is the only thing that matters.